particularly Professor Willett, who has been heading this up. But Professor Willett got involved in this really marvelous study of some, 90,000, I think it's up to about 120,000 nurses these days, and you've heard of it, I think. How many have heard of the Nurses' Health Study? Okay, everybody's heard of the Nurses' Health Study. He got involved in this question asking back in 1984, right after we had finished putting together a policy statement from the National Academy of Sciences to reduce fat intake. He organized this study to look at the relationship between fat intake and breast cancer for this large group of nurses. And after 8 years, 4 years, 8 years, and this subsequent 12 years, what he found was as fat, if you look at the amount of fat intake that women are consuming over that range, he saw no relationship. That observation is nearly destroyed. It really caused a big problem. It's almost destroyed the diet and disease proposition to some considerable extent. Because all of a sudden now you're hearing, public's getting confused. If fat has nothing to do with breast cancer, what next? I mean, it's that kind of thing. I wanted to tell you what the answer to this is. Namely, look at the yellow thing. I say it's all in the R, and you probably don't know what correlation coefficients are, regression coefficients. But basically, it turns out that in the original data of Ken Kell, that slide shown there, as fat intake goes up, animal protein intake goes up right along with it. You get about a 90% correlation. The highest you can have is 100%. 90% is really impressive. So on an international basis, about 90%. In contrast, in Western populations, where we're eating all the wrong stuff, it turns out these women, and I can say that's for probably all people in this country who follow this advice, as they decrease their fat intake, by using lean cuts of meat and skim milk and this and that, as they decrease their fat intake, quite frankly, their animal protein, it was going up, if anything. So, they're gaining on this hand in theory, losing big time on this hand. Under those circumstances, if you look at the experimental data, I don't have the chance to get into this, but if you look at this critically, that's a recipe for disaster. Because it's not the animal fat, it's animal-based foods, really is what this is all about. And it has to do with this correlation coefficient we know, and we have some very good data on what this is all about. Now, I just threw some other odds and ends in here just to catch your attention. I think this was mentioned by who? Dr. Bernard, I believe. And you know what? Oh, Dean Orney said this. No, he said this. He's got this study going right now. We already have this information on prostate cancer and skim milk. How many of you heard this? How many of you read this in the Los Angeles Times or the New York Times or heard on TV? I mean, the Harvard group has done much of this work, and I do have to give them credit for this, and that includes Walt Willett, by the way. No, actually, it doesn't include Walt. It's another guy by the name of Ed Giovannucci and June Chen, who's now at Berkeley. They have summarized recently of 14 case-control studies that have been done on dairy and prostate cancer. Of 14, 12 have shown a statistically significant relationship. The other two just aren't strong enough to see anything. And they conclude that of all the predictors of prostate cancer, the consumption of dairy is the best predictor of prostate cancer. And how many people have heard this? It's just not getting out there. Somebody's, I don't want to say cooking the data, but they're controlling things. Okay, now, I sort of finally come to this point of view of, I guess in a scientific sense, being a bit of a fool and start talking about these kinds of things publicly. And the information is getting out there, I think, to some extent about the protein thing. And lo and behold, in 2002, we had this report, this esteemed report that comes from the Food and Nutrition Board of the National Academy of Sciences, a group of people. I mean, this particular group of people are the ones who set national nutrition policy. They're the ones who set dietary guidelines, not dietary guidelines, but they're the ones that determine RDAs and things like this. I mean, they're very powerful. They're working behind the scenes, usually unbeknownst to the American public, and setting standards. And the references they set, and they review them every 5 years or so, the references they set are used to establish what the school lunch program looks like. They're the references set for hospital food. You know how great that is. It's the references set for the WIC program, Women, Infants, and Children's program. I mean, this is what it's all about. Well, they just came out just last year with this report, and this is on the front page of their executive summary and their news summaries. The report recommends that to meet the body's daily nutritional needs while minimizing risk for chronic disease, adults should consume 10 to 35% from protein. Wow. That's incredible. And furthermore, the added sugars, you know, and they're specific. They're making this, that candy, soft drinks, fruit drinks, pastries, other sweets, should comprise no more than 25% of total calories consumed. It's just a coincidence, by the way, that M&M Mars helped to fund this study. And the Coca-Cola industry. This is National Academy of Science. This is the body that's supposed to be making the sort of prominent statement. And I served on a number of those expert panels myself, and I don't remember when we were doing that we had that kind of support. We were using public money. Now the industry is coming in and sort of getting some money behind us. And yeah, I know it doesn't have any effect on all of this, but to say that 35% protein is okay, it's associated with it minimizing, you know, chronic disease risk, I think it's obscene. I don't know how else to say it. The 25% added sugars, by the way, is really interesting. They said 25% at the same time the WHO was coming up with a report about the same time where they're making similar kinds of determinations. They said the maximum should be 10%. And the chairman is a friend of mine, the chairman of that panel, Phil James. So they said 10%. And here in the West, this came out just before the WHO report did. They said 25%. So I'm wondering, how can a group of scientists, two groups of scientists, come up with these very different figures? 25%, you can go up to 20, or 10%? Well, it turns out, as they say, I don't know, maybe the M&M Mars did have something to do with it. The sugar industry gets on their high horse and basically are going and threatening the WHO report and the panel and said, get that thing, that 10% up to 25%. If you don't, we're going to go see Tommy Thompson. We got some friends in the White House. We're going to go to Congress, and we're going to ask the United States to withdraw funds from the United Nations. That's what happened. And I don't know how many of you really know that, but they really did use strong-arm tactics to try to get the United Nations panel to change their 10% level for added sugars up to 25%, like the United States did. I mean, we behaved. We did the right thing. We got up to 25%, you see. I'll come back to the protein thing just for a minute. I just want to show you how important this really is. I've talked about the 5 to 20%. And incidentally, let me say this, that the experimental animal work that I did, or we did, experimental animals, or like us animals, the amount of protein we require is the same as they do, and it's all sort of coincidence, about the same. If you look at the range of intake of protein for us animals, us humans, we range between 11 and 22%. That is, 5% of us are a little lower than 11%. 5% of us, you know, the weightlifters and stuff, some of the weightlifters up 22%. The amount that we've known for 50 years how much protein we only need 10%. Our average intake is 17%. We're somewhere between 11 and 22. And nobody hardly goes above 22. Now this esteemed body is coming along and telling us we can go up to 35. You know, welcome Atkins. I could go on and on about this, but I won't. Especially since the chairman of the Food and Nutrition Board is now the director of the division of which I'm in at Cornell University. Okay, so let me make a couple concluding remarks here. I think it's time, you know, we've got to take this idea and bring it to a new level of discussion. It's got to have certain characteristics. We can't just sit around and talk to each other. We've got to somehow invade the medical establishment. I know what it's all about. And really open this up for the public, because I think the public's really interested in this. I disagree with many of my colleagues who say the public's not interested. And I'm going to say this. Whereas major disease rates have remained high in recent years, whereas the cost of medical care is the highest in the world, a couple of givens, whereas contemporary food production is costly and environmentally unsound, isn't it possible that we should start taking nutrition seriously? And if it's properly investigated, interpreted, and practiced, it could become the premier biological science of the future? I mean, this is where it's at. It's not there now. It has something to do with who's controlling the information. And this is something the public really doesn't understand. What goes on behind the scenes in the development of policy, reference standards, you know, it's basically who's controlling the agenda. That's what it's about. And it's something that's terribly misunderstood by the public. Almost no one really knows about this unless you've been in the boardrooms and sort of watched this kind of thing. And incidentally, I don't want to treat this superficially. It's not about industry funding the research. The industry probably funds about 5 to 10% of the research in this field in this country. It's money coming from the government, basically. It's also not about industry paying off people. It's also not about the vast majority of scientists being, you know, dishonest and stuff like that. It's not true. The vast majority of scientists are hardworking, diligent, devoted people to their work. They're working in kind of narrow little areas. So, I mean, we do have a class of very hardworking people. I don't want to disparage them. We have a few people sort of behave like something else. They just sort of make there the transition. So in any case, I don't want to get into this too much, but what I do want to say is that we need to take this information, elevate it to a level of professionalism, widely discussed, and get it out there and start thinking about it in that sort of way. And so I've been asking myself, at least, you know, where do we go with all this? How does this happen? How do we expand this story beyond us who have been involved in this to some extent? As I say, it's about who controls the information, who funds it, who makes policy, who dispenses it. You know, who's making policy is the one. That's really, you heard, who was it? Yeah, Neil Bernard talk about what the American Cancer Society wants to run some bulls down to Peach Street in Atlanta these days, and every other street in the United States. And I would really urge you to follow Neil's advice on that. Contact him. We need to have transparency, discourse, and open education. Right now, we can't have that because we don't have the resources. We're sort of tied into sort of doing little bits of studies here and there and stuff. I really am interested in somehow going to establish, let's say, at a major institution that has some recognition, to establish a place where we can have lots of transparency, lots of discourse, lots of open education. And the only way we can do that is to have the funding that lasts forever. It's the only way. We can't sort of just go from 2 years, 3 years, go back into the till all the time, because that's how the information is controlled. I know it so well. The control is really who has the funding to give out to do what is being done. Those of us in this kind of field here, we don't have any money. We can't. I mean, who's going to fund vegetarian research, for crying out loud? You know, it's really difficult. And so we need to sort of figure out some way to get this going. And quite frankly, we have, in fact, given consideration to this at Cornell. We are and have been for many years ranked as the top institution, the #1 institution in the country, both in terms of quality and quantity. And I think Cornell would be a good place to sort of hang our hat in doing this kind of thing, as long as we have the resources. We thought this through fairly carefully as to what we want to do. We have an internal advisor group. We have an external advisory group, really a blue-ribbon panel, I should say. And so we're on track of trying to do this. And I'm just going to conclude to tell you that, you know, whether we do it or whether someone else does it, this is what we need to do. We've got to raise the consciousness of this country to the level of really understanding this. And two of my colleagues are here, actually, who are sort of running the shop for us. Dr. Banu Parpia and David Cushell, where are you? Way back. And way in the back there. I think Jeff invited me to... Jeff invited me to go ahead and make these remarks. I hope that you don't think it's self-serving. I'm too old for that anyhow, and we'll go on and do something. We'll do something else. But I want just simply in terms of the idea. I want the public to get more involved in this. I want all kinds of scientists and other sorts of people to get involved in this kind of symposium and workshops and study period, and to have the money to do it. And so there is a brochure in your packet, I think, that's called PLN. Program for Lifetime Nutrition. I'll leave that thought with you and simply say, we have arrived with this information, and if you don't believe me, wait till you hear Dr. Esselstyn and Dr. Furman, and Dr. McDougall, and Dr. Lyle, who's got this new book out telling us why we can't get on with these, Dr. Lyle and Dr. Goldhammer. I mean, these are the people out there really doing things. And we're ready to go. We just need to involve the public more in this sort of thing and to get that kind of support. Thank you.